Everybody, Jeff Urbin here from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park. I want to welcome you all back to another one of our Facebook Wednesday events. On behalf of our director, Paul Sparrow, and the entire staff here at the Roosevelt Presidential Library, I want to welcome you back. Today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic, the Roosevelt relationship. And we're doing this on March 17th, the 116th anniversary of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's wedding. And March 17th is a very important day in Roosevelt history, obviously because of the wedding. It's also Eleanor Roosevelt's mother's birthday, so happy birthday. And it is also the anniversary of FDR becoming the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which he often said was one of his favorite jobs. Now, today we're going to do something very dangerous, and that is talk about somebody else's relationship. But before we do that, since we're going to be talking about relationships, I thought it might be nice to talk a little bit about some of our own relationships for a moment or two. And there's a thing that often causes conflict and friction in people's relationships, and it's not money, it's not infidelity, it's not child rearing, it's this. Which way does it go? Does it go like this, or does it go like this? Does it go, how does it go? Under, or does it go over? And you may have had this fight in your own house. And so I thought it might be nice to start today with a little relationship helper by showing you a copy of the original patent right by John Wheeler, which does in fact show that the paper is supposed to go over. It's not supposed to go under, like that. Okay, so I suspect that many of you have to go make an apology to a significant other right now, and I'll give you a minute to do that. And those of you that refuse to admit that you're wrong, even in the face of the evidence, we'll spend our time with a little St. Patrick's Day riddle. And the riddle goes like this. What's Irish and stays out all night? And I can see here in the chat, someone says leprechauns. No, it's not leprechauns. My Aunt Betty, well, that's something you should maybe take up at Thanksgiving. The thing that is Irish and stays out all night is none other than patio furniture. All right, settle down. Now that we're all back, we're going to talk about the relationship of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. And we're going to talk about, how their childhood sort of prepared them for marriage or didn't prepare them for marriage. We'll talk a little bit about the magical early years, the breaking point, some of the possible others, and then we'll take a look at some of the forces that sort of forged them into who it was that they became. Now, the Roosevelt marriage has been described in many ways. Sometimes it's been described as a failure. Sometimes it's been described as a sham. Sometimes it's been described as a tragic compromise, a political partnership. But I think the best way to describe the Roosevelt marriage is with the word Roosevelt itself. Roosevelt means field of roses. It's Dutch for field of roses. And Hazel Rowley described the marriage as being something of a bed of roses. And I think she hit that spot on, because when we find ourselves looking at a bed of roses, what do we find? Well, we find that the roots run deep, just as the Roosevelt roots did. We find that there are wonderful, fragrant, flowers that are beautiful, beautiful parts of this bed of roses. And the Roosevelt marriage had that. We also find that there are some thorns and some prickly parts, right, as we go through. And certainly the Roosevelt marriage had that. But most important, we need to understand that a bed of roses must be tended to. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be appreciated for what it is that it's able to yield. And that, I think, is really what the Roosevelt relationship, the Roosevelt marriage is really all about. Now, I would like to also think about it in terms of being Franklin and Eleanor being two halves of sort of a more perfect whole. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. So where do these seeds for this bed of roses actually begins? Well, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were fifth cousins once removed. So I want to show you this chart to prove to you it's not as creepy and awkward as it might sound. So what we have here is, let's see, we have their relationship here. You've got Franklin over here. You've got Eleanor down here. And you've got to go back 5 generations before they share a relative, Nicholas Roosevelt. So although they come from the same clan, they are separated by 5 generations. Eleanor is the product of the Oyster Bay branch of the Roosevelt family, and Franklin Roosevelt is a product of the Hudson River branch of the family. And these two first meet, Franklin and Eleanor, in Hyde Park in 1886, when Franklin is 4 and Eleanor is just 2. ER's family was visiting Franklin's family in Hyde Park, and Franklin entertained Eleanor by giving him a pony ride on her back. So you might say that the relationship had some horsing around right from the beginning. And as the years passed, they bumped into each other periodically, through various Roosevelt family events and such. But the fireworks are thought to really have begun on November 17th, 1902, when Franklin and Eleanor attend a horse show in Madison Square Garden in New York, and they share seats in a box of Franklin's older brother, Rosie, who was about almost 27 years older. And there's some other Roosevelt cousins there, but Franklin and Eleanor take an interest in each other, and they begin this courtship. Well, over the next year, the romance begins to bloom, and it's exactly the kind of a romance that you would expect in two young people. A year later, Franklin invites Eleanor to the Harvard-Yale game, and he has a very important question he wants to ask her on that day. And of course, the question is, will you marry me? And he writes in his diary saying, quote, "After lunch, I have a never-to-be-forgotten walk to the river with my darling." And what we have here really is this idea of these two being in love in exactly the kind of way that you want young people to be in love. Now, over the course of the relationship and out through, looking back over history, this idea of a partnership kind of, is what it stays in our mind. But I want to be very clear about the fact that this was a real live romance when it first started out. So let's take a moment right here to take a look at why we might think of these two halves of the whole being really kind of an opposites attract, and yet at the same time, birds of a feather flock together. Okay, so opposites attract and birds of a feather. And, the Roosevelt marriage is so complex that it can be described with, these sort of cliches that seem to point in different directions. And we'll take a look at that. Franklin grew up here in Hyde Park in a very secure, very loving, very, warm, at least by Victorian standards, household. He was the only child. He has a half brother, Rosie Roosevelt, from James, his father's first marriage, who's almost 3 decades older than he is. And Franklin had everything he needed and most of what he wanted. He was the center of the world there in Hyde Park. His parents doted on him. They absolutely adored him, especially his mother, Sarah. And as a result, Franklin grew up and became a very confident, and some would say arrogant or cocky, very self-assured, and some would say maybe self-centered, and a very worldly-minded young man. He was good-looking, he was charming, he was outgoing, and he was ambitious. And all the conditions surrounding him in his growing up prepared him to develop that way. Eleanor had a different situation. She grew up in a often chaotic and dramatic family household. Her father was an alcoholic, and that caused all kinds of problems in the family. Her mother was vain and openly disappointed in Eleanor's appearance, and openly called her Granny as a nickname because she thought that her daughter reminded her of a little old lady. By the time Eleanor was 10 years old, she was an orphan. She was bounced around from family member to family member, finally ending up in Tivoli, and then her grandmother sent her off to Allenwood School. And it was there that she first began to discover herself and who she was and what she really thought and believed and felt and valued. And that was in large measure due to her mentor, Madame Silvestri. So as a result, Eleanor grew up as a timid, bookish, shy, insecure, and wanting to be loved young woman. So in this sense, they are opposites, and they are attracting. But together, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt complemented each other beautifully. She tempered his arrogance and his self-importance. She introduced him to things at a deeper level than he ever had looked at them before, like, poor people and the way they actually lived. And he lifted her up and sort of out of her shell and, pushed her outside of her comfort zone and her comfort limits and, helped her to not take herself so seriously and to take things so seriously. So in that sense, they complemented each other perfectly. And at the same time, they were both from a wealthy, connected, respected family in the high society of New York. Now, Franklin was far more comfortable with that than Eleanor ever was. But from that standpoint, they both kind of came from the same background. And they also had a common denominator, which was a love and almost worship of none other than Teddy Roosevelt, who was Eleanor's uncle and Franklin's distant cousin. So in that sense, they were two birds that were sort of flocking together. Now, back to the romance. They were crazy about each other. FDR referred to her as my angel, right? It's a far cry from Granny. And ER wrote to Sarah's mother, and she said, and I quote, "It is impossible for me to tell you how I feel toward Franklin. I can only say that my great wish is to always prove worthy of him." Okay, so this doesn't sound like a sham to me. It's a lovely, tender, romance of two young people who are crazy about each other and share some common beliefs and some common values and a common hero, Teddy Roosevelt. And then along comes Sarah. She wants them to keep the romance a secret for a year. Now, Sarah believes that, Eleanor's okay. There's nothing wrong with Eleanor. But by this point, Sarah's husband, James, has passed away, and Franklin is all she has left. And she doesn't want any competition for Franklin's attention and for his time. And she even takes Franklin on a Caribbean cruise in the hopes that the separation from Eleanor will help to dissolve the attraction. But it doesn't. It makes it stronger. And Eleanor and Franklin spent an entire year essentially fooling no one. Right? They were trying not to act engaged, but her cousin once described it as almost comical, the way that they would go to great pains to avoid each other when they were together, so as not to look like they were together, but in fact proving that, beyond a doubt, they were together. And they announced their engagement on December 1st, 1904, with plans to marry the following year. Now, let me just show you some pictures from the early relationship, and you'll get a sense of. Okay, so here they are on a picnic together, right? And he's cuddled up next to her. You can see the big smile on her face. He's obviously having a good time here as well. So they're out and they're enjoying themselves, just like young people should. Here they are also, Campobello. Looks like FDR has just gotten out of the water there. And, Eleanor is with them. She's holding his arm there so he can steady himself while he puts his shoe on. And looks like she's got a towel there. And again, clearly each of them enjoying themselves and each of them enjoying each other. So on March 17th, 116 years ago, this very day, 1905 in New York City, none other than Teddy Roosevelt, who's been on the job as President of the United States for less than 3 weeks at that point, is in New York for the St. Patrick's Day parade. And he's going to walk Eleanor down the aisle, so to speak. Now, she's actually married at her cousin's home, so she's not really married in a church. And in the process, Uncle Teddy inadvertently steals all of the attention away from Eleanor. And this is something that, kind of stands as a point of contention with her. She loved Uncle Teddy and she forgave him and everything. But, on your wedding day, you should be the center of attention if you're the bride. And that simply wasn't the case. Now, they get married, and Franklin is still working on his law degree, so they put off a honeymoon for a while. They come back to Hyde Park for a week, and then that summer, they go to Europe for an extended honeymoon, and they travel all around Europe. They visit England and France and Germany and Italy and Scotland and Switzerland, a proper rich people honeymoon. And early in the marriage, FDR was working as a lawyer. And Eleanor spent most of her time either having just had a baby or about to be having having a baby. They had, I think it was like 5 children in the first 5 or 6 years of their marriage. Now, Franklin Jr., the first Franklin Jr. passes away at less than a year old. And, this, of course, is a very terrible and tragic thing. Neither one of them was particularly happy about the way things were going in the early years of their marriage. Not that they were unhappy with each other, but it wasn't as fulfilling, and it wasn't, neither one of them was really doing what it was that they wanted to do. Now, in 1910, Franklin decides he's going to run for the state Senate, and Eleanor stood proudly by him. And FDR spent 3 years in Albany fighting Tammany Hall, and he connects with his friend Louis Howe, who is a big political operator. He's a reporter for an Albany newspaper, and they spend a lot of their time planning and scheming and working against Tammany Hall in the front room of their apartment up on State Street in Albany. And Eleanor can't help but overhear this. She can't help but become involved. She gets excited. She gets caught up in it, and she begins to take an interest in the excitement. Now, while FDR is there, he puts Wilson's name, not president yet, but he puts Woodrow Wilson's name into nomination for the presidency. And when Wilson wins the presidency, he sort of rewards FDR by appointing him to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So now they move to Washington, D.C. Now, it's important to understand that during this time, they're really beginning to have some career opportunity, right? Franklin is cutting his teeth as a politician. Eleanor's becoming more comfortable with the children, and she's also becoming more excited about Franklin's political career and the types of issues and things that he's looking to look into. Well, when Franklin moves to Washington, he has to, of course, attend all the ceremonial things and the dinners and the meetings and all that sort of stuff. And wherever Eleanor can, she comes with him. But she becomes increasingly involved in some of her own activities while she's there. And once the war starts, she becomes actively engaged in the home front war effort, operating, putting in some hours at a canteen in Union Station, working with the Red Cross, and then visiting vets at trauma centers when they came back. And she was building her work network and her activity level. And she was the wife of a junior cabinet member. And there was sort of a cadre of these women. And Franklin was busy with his work, and Eleanor was busy with hers with them. She became a real team player with FDR. She was very kind, considerate, thoughtful, patient, and this was a nice counterbalance to FDR's arrogance and impatience, and quite frankly, his ambition. And so together during this time, they learned about national issues, they learned about international issues, they learned about public affairs, and they learned about promoting the Roosevelt name and legacy, which was very important to both of them, going back, of course, to Teddy. And they were, in effect, being tempered and taught by this time early on in their marriage. Now, it was during this time that Lucy Mercer, this woman, enters the picture and comes on the scene. She had been recommended to Eleanor Roosevelt by one of her cousins as a potential assistant for finding her way around through the the warrens of Washington, D.C. political and social life. And Lucy became a family favorite. She was very likable. The kids loved her, and everyone came to love her, and maybe even FDR a little bit too much. And as Eleanor became busier and busier with her activities, Lucy began to fill in and stand in for Eleanor at events. Somewhere along the line, Franklin and Lucy begin to have an affair. Now, when Eleanor was out of town with the kids, Franklin would picnic with Lucy Mercer. He would go on drives with Lucy Mercer. He would have dinner at discreet friends' houses with Lucy Mercer. And Eleanor may have been picking up some of this vibe and some of this suspicion, and may have even heard the rumors, because she let Lucy Mercer go in June of 1917. Shortly thereafter, Lucy Mercer got a job at the War Department, where Franklin happened to work. It didn't last long, but it lasted long enough to look suspicious. And a year later, when Franklin was returning from an inspection tour in Europe, he had come down with a case of double pneumonia. And he came back to the townhouse that his mother had bought them in New York as a wedding gift and given to them as a Christmas gift the first year of their marriage. And he leaves the stuff in the lobby. He goes upstairs, and Eleanor, the dutiful wife, helps him to begin to unpack. And as she does this, she finds the satchel of love letters back and forth with Franklin and Lucy Mercer. And she says that she feels later on, she says that she felt as if the bottom fell out from under her, fell out underneath her world. She offered FDR a divorce, and FDR said, no, let's work this out. And he said this for two reasons. Number one was because Louis Howe was advising him, hey, if you can't run a marriage, how are you going to run a state or the country or any other elected office? Your political career will be over. And he also says, no, let's work this out, because his mother makes it very clear that there'll be no divorce in the family. You found her, you fell in love with her, you cheated on her, you work it out. And if you don't, I'm cutting you off from the Roosevelt family fortune. Now, Franklin promised he would never see Lucy Mercer again, and he kept this promise for quite a while, but he ends up going back on it. We'll get to that in a couple of minutes. So in a way, and I'm not trying to downplay or belittle the fact that Franklin cheated on Eleanor, but in a way, this becomes a very important moment in their relationship, because it becomes kind of a freeing moment for them each emotionally. It ends the lovey-dovey relationship that we see displayed in this picture, and it begins more of a relationship like we see in this picture. And you can see here how happy they are to be with each other. This is probably the roughest and darkest time in their marriage. But with the end of the lovey-dovey portion of their romance, their marriage can start a new era, which ends up lasting the rest of their lives. And it's a more professionally driven union, a union driven more by shared interests and mutual respect than a romantic love. Now, in the 1920s, FDR ends up on the vice presidential ticket with Cox out of Ohio, and he does that through a compromise with Tammany Hall. He throws his support to Cox and comes on as vice president, and he goes out and he very vigorously campaigns for the Cox ticket. And he brings Eleanor along. Women have just received the right to vote, and he thinks, wow, Eleanor is getting her political teeth cut here. I'll bring her along. She'll be very appealing to women voters. And in fact, she was. And as Roosevelt traveled around the country by train, Eleanor, sat and listened in on, FDR's speeches and FDR's strategy sessions with his advisors. And again, she's beginning to eat this stuff up. She's really beginning, to like this stuff. Now, there's, this myth, and it's not really a myth, but it's overstated, I think, that Eleanor was, this very shy, timid, introspective person. And she was at first. But over the course of her life, she was constantly working to come out of that. And it was difficult for her to do that, but she was making progress all along the way. In fact, she later says, you don't have to become a hero overnight. And I think her life really begins to show that. Well, they lose the election, and Franklin now has to ponder what he's going to do with the rest of his life. He knows he's probably going to run for president, and now he's got Tammany Hall up of his back. He's got some more national recognition, and he's getting ready to go, and along comes polio. And the polio so badly affects him that when he first contracts it, he is paralyzed really from the neck down. He's so weak he can't even lift a pen to sign his name or a soup spoon to feed himself. And so Eleanor, the dutiful wife, steps in and she begins to nurse him immediately on the spot while they're waiting to get doctors together. and to get there to help. And then also she begins to nurture his belief that he can come back from this politically, and that he can come back from this and continue on with a career if that's what he wants to do. And in fact, she is pushing him to be able to do that. So at the same time, Louis Howe is in cahoots with her to do this. So we got to get Franklin back in here. We got to get him back going again. And she realizes it's not just for his physical health, it's for his mental and emotional health as well. She realizes that Franklin has too much to offer to give up public life and go back to Hyde Park and become a gentleman's squire, which is exactly what his mother wants him to do. So this puts Eleanor and Sarah at a little bit more of a loggerheads with each other. And at this point, Eleanor really begins to start feeling and caring less and less what her mother-in-law is thinking. She knows what's right for Franklin, she believes, and she starts to see her mother more and more as sort of a relic of the Victorian era, if you will. So it's at this point that Eleanor begins to chart a new course for herself on behalf of her husband. And so in a way, polio allows her to do that. Because whereas if she were beginning to get out there and, make things happen and be more politically involved and make speeches and write letters and essays and those sorts of things on her own, she would very easily be seen as an ambitious woman. And that was not something you wanted to be seen at that time as. And so what she's doing here is she's doing all those things, but instead of being seen as, ambitious and self-serving, she's being seen as the dutiful wife of Franklin Roosevelt, who is trying to keep his political career together. And she's working to promote Franklin as they go. So we see that this partnership is really starting to develop, and it is a partnership. She's working for him and he's working to try to get back to some semblance of his regular life. And it's ER through her work and the work of Louis Howe that keeps FDR's political hopes alive and keeps FDR's career alive to a point where he is then able to come back in 1924 and 1928 to the Democratic conventions, and Roosevelt is back. It's teamwork, once again, Roosevelt teamwork. And as he decides to return to politics, he decides he's going to run for governor of New York, and he wins the governorship. And Eleanor is splitting her time between Albany and New York City, where she teaches and is involved with various, social and political movements and activities down there. So while FDR is in Albany, dry running what will become some of the programs for the New Deal, she is going back and forth between New York, and it's about the time of the polio that Missy Lehan enters the scene. And she is a devoted young secretary to Franklin, and she begins to take over some of the hostess jobs in Albany while Eleanor is not there. So a very comfortable pattern begins to develop. Eleanor is there part of the time. Eleanor is there not part of the time. Franklin is pursuing his interests as governor. Eleanor is pursuing her interests in New York City in teaching and political activities there as well. And it's really this time frame that the new relationship of the Roosevelts begins to develop. And the Roosevelts tended to surround themselves with what they called the gang. And this was a group of friends and advisors. Very often they would stay with the Roosevelts. They would come and stay at the White House when the Roosevelts were in the White House. And this gang included people like Louis Howe and Missy Lehan, Lorena Hickok, Earl Miller, and a slew of other people who kind of came in and out of this sort of sphere here. And it's this group of people who are coming in and out with their ideas, coming in and out with their interests, that help to fill the void in the world of the Roosevelts, sort of the emotional void that you might think exists there. Eleanor needs a place away from the big house where Sarah is to entertain her friends and to, work on her movements and stuff. And Franklin encourages her by saying, well, why don't you build a stone cottage here on my property, which is adjacent to my mother's, and that can be your place. So he's encouraging her, right? He's not upset by this. He's encouraging her to develop her own life and her own friends. He is, of course, doing the same thing there as well. Now, Roosevelt sets his sights on the presidency, and this was really something that, he'd been planning all along. Louis Howe thought he should be president all the way back when he met him, in 1912 up in Albany, working for the state Senate. And there's this, again, myth that Eleanor didn't want to go to the White House, that, she was terrified about him becoming president. And I don't think it was so much that she was terrified of him becoming president or going to the White House as she was concerned about what that would mean for her work. She was more worried about how it might impact her activities than the real concern of, just being in the White House. It was the uncertainty of how it would impact her. And I don't mean that from a selfish standpoint, but she had things that she wanted to get done. So FDR wins in 1932, and Eleanor Roosevelt begins to craft the job of First Lady to suit herself. Now, many people say Eleanor Roosevelt, changed the role of First Lady. I don't think she did. I think she changed the role of First Lady for herself, but that role as First Lady then shrank when she left and, kind of came back into a more secondary position than it certainly was during the 12 years that she was First Lady with Franklin Roosevelt. She begins to travel for him, and she travels and observes things. He trains her, when you're going on a train, take a look at what's going on before you get to the town. Look at the tracks, look at the houses along the tracks, the clothes on the clothesline, the toys the kids are playing with. That will give you a better sense of what it's like in that community than the center of town where they're going to take you, where everything's been all cleaned up and spiffed up. I need to know how America is really doing out there. He says, if you go to a soup kitchen and they're telling you that they've got, chicken gumbo, stick your nose in there to make sure it's chicken gumbo and not oatmeal. Give me the facts, give me the information that I need. And she does this, and she reports back to him, and he bounces ideas off of her, and she bounces ideas off of him. And she very often prods him to do more than it is that he's doing. And he develops a typically brilliant Roosevelt approach to managing her activities. And it's all done with one sentence. And the sentence is, well, that's my Eleanor. And if Eleanor goes out there and she becomes involved in things that are very good for the president and his administration politically, he says, well, that's my Eleanor. But if she goes out there and she causes controversy and, she begins to, pick up some criticism and some flack for what she's doing, he simply, sort of shrugs it off and says, well, that's my Eleanor, as if, what am I going to do? It's just the missus. And she was always very mindful of the fact that he was the president and that he was elected president and was elected president 4 times. She was very mindful of the fact that the role of the First Lady is a ceremonial role. It is not a official government position. And so she always deferred to the president on topics and things when push came to shove. But she did push him on things like civil rights. He wanted to move along very carefully so as not to lose the support of the Southern Democrats in the Congress, and she thought he should be moving and doing more. It was, she supported the anti-lynching bill. He was against it. Politically, he had to be. She was the one who pushed him to meet with Black labor leaders to prevent the March on Washington. She spoke out against Japanese-American internment. She was against it. The president issued the executive order that ultimately led to it happening. And when she spoke out against it, he told her, listen, we've got to have unity on this. You got to, chillax and calm down with this. You can't be, contradicting me publicly. And so she didn't. She visited the camps on her own, sort of, under the radar, and didn't speak out publicly. She went on goodwill tours around the world, to England twice during the war, to the South Pacific during the war, which added an enormous amount of encouragement to the troops and to the folks of England. And going back to the attack at Pearl Harbor, it was Eleanor Roosevelt who first addressed the nation. Remember, it happened on a Sunday morning. She was scheduled to go on a radio broadcast that night and talk about her Christmas shopping, right? Because we're just a few weeks out from Christmas. The Great Depression was still going on. And the idea was, to go out and encourage people to, to continue on with their Christmas shopping. She scraps that script and she says, as I meet with you tonight, I'm talking to you tonight, the president's down the hall meeting with members of Congress, members of the military, to sort out what's happened today. And he's going to talk to you about it tomorrow. So she is the first person to address the nation about the crisis at Pearl Harbor and basically saying, just relax, let's get through the night. President will talk to you tomorrow and we'll see where we go from there. I think the most important thing that proves this relationship, this partnership, this shared values that was most important for the world, really, was the idea of the four freedoms. FDR in January of 41 gives the four freedoms, what comes to be known as the Four Freedoms speech. It was actually just a State of the Union address. And in there, he lays out his four freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And he says, if you go to war, if you have to go to war, and we're not in the war yet when he says this, these are four fundamental things that are worth fighting for. And he backs that up later in that year, in August of 41, with the Atlantic Charter, where he meets with Winston Churchill and they draw up the Atlantic Charter, promising freedom of the seas, promising freedom of trade, promising freedom of movement, basically offering the world this view of these freedoms. In 1942, shortly after the attack at Pearl Harbor in January, he creates he gets a group of people together at a conference in Washington, people that are, nations that are going to stand up against the Nazis, and he begins to refer to them as the United Nations. Okay, the United Nations. In 1943, the next year, he's in Tehran and he's sketching out what he thinks the sketch for the United Nations should look like, the structure. And he says there should be an executive committee, there should be the 40 United Nations, and there should be the 4 policemen. And what should the United Nations do? It should help to create an international labor organization. It should help to create a food organization and a health organization. Basically, those 3 things would work toward the 4 freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of expression. And it's Eleanor Roosevelt, who Harry Truman appoints to the American delegation to the United Nations because he understands the Roosevelt legacy and the Roosevelt name, and he understands that Eleanor Roosevelt carries with her the mantle of her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, and all that that brings. But he also understands that Eleanor Roosevelt is a force herself to be reckoned with. She is that other half of the whole. She is that other half of the partnership. And Eleanor is true to her expectations. And in fact, she puts in the preamble to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. And in our museum, when you come to visit, you will see the president's desk is set among 4 glass plates, and each of those is etched with one of the 4 freedoms, because really that's what the Roosevelts were working to do for the world from day one. From President Roosevelt's first words to the country are, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that becomes one of his 4 freedoms. And the 4 freedoms, it really becomes the great legacy of the Roosevelts, of both of the Roosevelts, Franklin and Eleanor. Now, before we end this, we need to take a look at one last thorn in the bed of roses. And that is that when President Roosevelt passes away on April 12, 1945, despite the fact that he promised he would never see Lucy Mercer again, she was there when he died. And when Eleanor found out, of course, she was understandably hurt. But by then, she and Franklin had been through so much, and they had accomplished so much, and they had inspired so many, that although it did hurt her, at that point, in a lot of ways, it didn't really matter anymore. And on the train back to Washington, accompanying her body, her husband's body back to Washington, she looks out at the hundreds of thousands of people lining the rail lines all the way up from Warm Springs into Washington, and then Washington back to Hyde Park. And she realizes just how much Franklin was loved. And she once said, in relation to the affair and their relationship, she said she realized that men must be who they are and life must be lived as it is. And so she was able to put that aside. And that is how they both lived their lives and managed their marriage. They realized that they had to be who they were. They realized after the affair that they weren't able to be there emotionally the way the other person needed, whether that was due to damage in the childhoods as they were growing up, or whether it was just a misunderstanding in what the marriage was supposed to be. Whatever the reason was, they weren't able to do that. But that didn't diminish love at a different level for the Roosevelts. And it was a marriage that was tempered, and a marriage that was tortured by a domineering mother-in-law, the scars and wounds of their childhoods, the death of a child, the raising of 5 children who then went on to have 19 marriages among them, infidelity, sudden and unexpected disability, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, an assassination attempt, 4 national campaigns for the presidency, and the creation of a world body. What marriage could have sustained all of that unscathed? There was only one marriage that was made of the 2 halves of the same whole. That's what you needed to be able to do that. It was the marriage of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Truly a bed of roses. So happy anniversary, 116, to those crazy kids. Now we'll open it up to some questions and answers. Oh, but before I do that, let me show you a couple of other pictures. So here is one of the things that we talked about, right? What's wrong with this picture? Well, it might be this person right here, right, who is both physically between her son and his wife, and emotionally and intellectually, let's say. They're always thinking about Sarah being there in the middle of that. Here we see a bit later in the relationship, and you can begin to see it's starting to come together. It's starting to, be more of that partnership that we talked about. Here they are, clearly enjoying themselves, right? Even their stances are somewhat the same. And, they're enjoying being out there. They're enjoying meeting people. They're enjoying what it is that they're looking to do. Here they are again. Laughter and happiness in the back of the car on the way to one of the inaugurations. This is one of the ways I want to remember the Roosevelt relationship, the Roosevelt marriage. But before we open it to questions and answers, I want to share this last picture with you. This is the one I always think of when I think of the Roosevelt marriage. It's Franklin and Eleanor side by side, making their way through the storm. Let's see what we got in terms of questions. Did Eleanor have affairs? Well, there was this group of other people that were in their lives: Earl Miller, Lorena Hickok, Missy Lehan. We don't really know. All the evidence that points to that stuff appears to be circumstantial. We do know about the affair with Lucy Mercer and Franklin Roosevelt because, the letters were found. The rest of that stuff, circumstantial. The rest of that stuff, up to conjecture. I personally believe that the Roosevelts were the kind of people that liked to have people around them, that needed to have people around them, and that tended to love the people around them and drew from them and upon them for emotional support. Whether or not there was anything, sexual in that, whether or not there was any hanky-panky, only the people that were involved in those relationships know if it ever reached that level. So we really don't know. How did Sarah Delano's passing affect the dynamic of their relationship? Well, by the time that Sarah passed away, she passed away way late. It was 1941 in November. Of course, she probably didn't think it was way late, but November of 41. Now, keep in mind, the president only lives until April of 45, so he's only around another 3.5 or 4 years. So by this point, Eleanor has kind of come to grips with the fact that she's never going to be able to please Sarah, and that she just has to go on and do what she needs to do for her own, political and social agenda. And so Sarah is beginning to play a little bit less of a role influentially that way. What did change when Sarah passed away was that the Roosevelt family fortune then passed to Franklin. And so he was, less having to depend upon Mama for the financial support. He had some income of his own, through some investments and through some money that he had made, with his governorship and his presidential salary and such. 15% of which he gave back to the government in respect out of the fact that things were going so bad during the Great Depression. So it didn't really have that big of an impact on them that way, more of a financial situation. Let's see. Yep, Jeff saying that mother died just 5 years before FDR. That is correct. Let's see here. Looks like that's it. 19 marriages among the children. Wow, so much for no divorce. Well, it depends on how you look at this, right? You could argue that they believed in marriage so much they just kept going at it, right? Maybe they were in search of that kind of relationship that their parents had. Not a perfect relationship, but a relationship that worked and a relationship that met the needs of both people. And I think that it's only fair to say, that the children grew up with a lot of pressure. Your mother's Eleanor Roosevelt, your father is Franklin Roosevelt. Those are some pretty big shoes to fill. And it was very often difficult for the children to know whether or not people were coming to them because of who they were or coming to them because of who their parents were. So it was very difficult for them sometimes to, make those assessments and those judgments in relationships. So I'm not so willing to pass judgment on that 19 marriages, except to say that, maybe they were trying to find that kind of way that it worked for Franklin and Eleanor. And it did work. They kept that marriage together for 40 years. And they lie next to each other in the Rose Garden here in Hyde Park, just 50 yards, 60 yards from where they first met when he was 4 and she was 2. And what I always find so amazing about those headstones in general is that you see the person's name, you see the year they were born and the year that they die, and that little dash in between represents everything. Nobody thinks about the dash, but in that dash is everything they accomplished in their lives. And I don't think President Roosevelt, would have accomplished as much without her, and I don't think she would have accomplished as much without him. They were these two halves to that whole. Let's see. What else do we have here? Oh, somebody thanking me for a lovely celebration of the Roosevelt Union and anniversary. Yeah, I don't think of it as sadly as some people do. Tragic partnership or tragic compromise or that sort of stuff. I think they worked it out. I think they worked it out to have it work for both of them, and they certainly did have those early years of all the the love and the fun and the frolic, the way that you would hope that they had that. It would have been very sad if they hadn't had that at all, but they always did have that. I think they always still had some ember of that flame that carried them through the rest of their time together. Okay. Here's someone talking about how Eleanor going down to the coal mine. Yeah, right. She was hands-on. She was feet on. She was right on, right? She went down there and she, she went and she experienced what people were feeling because she needed to report back to the president about what was going on there, how the New Deal programs were being, embraced and used and impacting regular people in regular, ways of life. Now, he got thousands of letters after the fireside chats. Every time he did a fireside chat, he gave these great letters, thousands of letters would come in. I think he had something like 27 secretaries that had to handle all the letters that came in. And these were a good feedback loop, allowing, the president to get a sense of how things were going. But by having Mrs. Roosevelt go out there and see for herself, to bring back a firsthand, trusted assessment of how things were going and how things were being played out, was critically important to his relationship. It was critically important to the way things were happening and going on, out there with regular folks in the country. Remember, President Roosevelt always said when he gave his fireside chats, he imagined himself talking over the fence to a Dutchess County neighbor, just explaining things in simple language about, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm trying to make it happen, and what ends up, if I can, get it across to my neighbors, I can get it across to the rest of the country. He used Eleanor as a check to make sure he was able to do that. What else do we have here? Okay. Did Eleanor give true opinions about the internment camps to FDR? Yeah, Eleanor, understood that these were not happy places. I mean, to their credit, the Japanese Americans, these Americans that were in these camps, made the best of the situation, and were loyal Americans in the fact that they put up with this, and they tried to continue on with their lives as best they could in the camps. However, that's nothing like living your life in the real life world. And Eleanor understood this, and she expressed this concern early on. But the president had a lot on his plate at that time, and had a lot that he needed to take care of. The political pressure was such that there was a lot of anti Asian sentiment in the country, right? Then. And so he was again responding somewhat to this political need, which he very often felt that he needed to do in order to get his larger agenda put forward. FDR had a big influence on all the important work ER did after his death. I think so. I think that there was a shared value system. There was a shared agenda. There was a shared sense of what should be done and what must be done. And I think that that was present when they were together, starting off very young, very early, with their worship of Teddy Roosevelt. And I think that continued all the way on throughout Eleanor's life and Franklin's life. Certainly, her closeness and proximity to the president and having the president's ear for 12 years was very important to allow her to sort of see the inside ways things were working in the government and in Washington and in the world. And she gained a lot of experience from that she was able then to bring to her work with the United Nations and some of the other things that she was involved with. After that time period. So, some of this stuff was sort of built into her just by being a Roosevelt. A lot of it was learned as she worked so closely with Franklin and as they continued on in their quest to make the world a better place. I always think of the Roosevelts as futurists. That would be the word I would describe them. They were both futurists. They both looked at where they were, understood where they were, understood that they were in tough conditions, whether it was a world war, a Great Depression, polio, a not so great marriage, a not so great family life for Eleanor growing up. I think they always saw where they were and then imagined where they wanted to be. Imagine what the world could be. Imagine what it could hold. And then they both worked very diligently to reach that future, to build a bridge from where they were to where they wanted to be. They were always looking down the road, not at, a week or 2 or 6 months or a year, but way down the road, 5 years, 10 years, future generations, our children, our children's children. And they began to build those pathways that way. And I think that was another one of those things that, tied them so closely together as we've discussed here today. Okay, so have a happy St. Patrick's Day. Happy anniversary to Franklin and Eleanor. Happy birthday to Eleanor's mom. And, we are just delighted to be able to do these programs for you here on these Wednesdays. Please come back and join us again. We would love to talk more about the Roosevelts and more about the things that they were able to bring about in their lives for our lives. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again sometime. Bye-bye.